Rudolph.
How do you turn this off? All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you very much. So my name is Rudolph Sinkovics, and I think the starting point here is that I'm gonna look into a specific context from the perspective of an international business scholar. So I'm collaborating. I've been collaborating and invited by Khalid to work on this project. And the thinking in international business, where I'm sort of scholarly housed, is largely it's the multinational firm which is shaping the world, and as a consequence, governments would follow on by supporting very strongly multinationals. So in international business, the strategic thought currently is, what can a multinational do in order to survive better than before? And largely the contemporary thinking is that what they have to do is really to retain power and control over whatever happens after the inception of products. So they have to control largely the access to consumers or by consumers, but actually they don't need to own it. So this is the concept which has been popularized by colleagues such as Peter Buckley and Gary. So they are largely saying, well, the best way for multinational these days, what they have to do is really, they do no longer operate themselves. They just recline into very much upstream, into research and development, in-house research and development. That's for, if you look at, for instance, a smartphone technology, it's largely what Samsung and also Apple would be doing. So you design, you research, bring together different kind of technologies, assemble them, however, outside the firm. So somebody else takes ownership of, takes actually care of these activities. And the problem, or sort of the development, essentially the consequences for emerging markets is effectively that you could argue that there is a process of what Zhang has indicated, the kicking away the ladder. So it restricts essentially the development space. If you don't manage to climb up towards research and development, then you're doomed. If you don't manage to control the end market, if you don't own the retail stores where these products are being sold, then actually again, you would be doomed. So that's the contemporary thinking in international business. And as Khalid has outlined earlier, coming from a slightly different perspective, is that what we observe, however, is not necessarily the reality that holds true for northern firms, right? So the contemporary thinking in international business is when you go out there, and that's what we have been doing. We were going to India, to Brazil, and to China, and we are doing scoping work, and we found completely different patterns, right? So firms, which, as Khalid was indicating, integrated firms, a lot of in-house research, and effectively also increasingly controlling of the supply of the demand side. Although, interestingly enough, quite diversified in the sense that some firms restrict themselves to their home space. So Indian firms would then sort of control the Indian market, but what they're doing internationally is done for a different purpose. So when a firm such as Bosideng, one of these famous firms that we have also been studying, what they are doing effectively, they are going to England and buying up a domestic English firm in order to learn and acquire resources to understand how to market properly, and that know-how is actually not then deployed in the northern market, but it is, however, deployed in the Indian context. So essentially, traditional international business thinking would say, okay, what and where do the multinationals operate, and how do you effectively control? So visually depicted, I can show you this. This is sort of a reinterpretation of a famous smile curve, which is effectively introduced by the Stan G, a CEO of Acer. He said, well, I'm smiling when both on my left side and on my right side, the lips are high up there. That's where research and development is happening, and then it is also where basically distribution and engagement with consumers is happening. So the traditional global factory notion, which is very popular in my own discipline, suggests really what we should do is disintegrate, right? We disintegrate, but we control still the whole value chain. But it's not that we own it, somebody else own it and falls into the rules of governance that we are dictating. So when we went out, we saw something different, just a few advertisements for also Marie-Therese and Afonso, who have made contributions to this literature very strongly. But I think a lot of this recent work in IB has essentially been inspired by what are the EM&Es, the emerging multinationals, doing in order to come close to the northern type of firms. And we felt that this is not necessarily the whole story. So our study is coming in with this understanding. There is something different. The end markets are shifting. Also, some of the firms are truly integrated. And what we wanted to know is, okay, how does this affect? How are their approaches to business actually incorporated in the business model? So we looked very, very strongly around, okay, what are they doing within the firms to do what they're doing, but in terms of also implementing issues of standards, right? So we looked at the business tool as an analytical tool, and this example that I'm going to introduce today is specifically from the context of India, where we've done a series of expert interviews. We were talking to business leaders, specifically sustainability champions, and what we were trying to find out, and this is a very well-known concept that has been popularized over the last 7 years or so, introduced by colleagues Osterwalder and Pineur. So the business model as kind of a representation of how a firm makes money, right? So on the left side, you would see the cost structure that is essentially engaging with particular partners. You are spending, you are investing, but on the other side, in populating particular retail outlets, engaging with customers, you also then returning revenue streams. So we used it as a conceptual tool, as a background, and we built on top of it the questions, okay, what does sustainability thinking in rising power firms in India, Brazil, and China, but particularly I will focus on India, how is responsibility thinking, CSR thinking embodied in the business model? So how are they effectively, and this was triggered also by scoping visits. When we went to talk to the likes of Tata in India, then the response was always, oh, CSR. For us, you know, CSR is in our DNA, right? And we were hearing that almost like a mantra, and then we started to think, well, can we actually believe what they are saying or what we are hearing here? And we very quickly understood that CSR actually has carries quite different meanings across those countries. And a lot of what CSR means in the Indian context is to do with philanthropy, but also it's linked to a quite revolutionary introduction that has been taking place in the last 2 years. CSR law is a kind of stipulated upon firms that they have to give 2% of their revenues annually to social responsibility causes. And these social responsibility causes, which in itself is also quite interesting, these social responsibility causes would be administered on behalf, in most cases, on behalf of the firms by some authorities or intermediaries. So it's essentially, you could argue to a degree, an enforced stipulation. So the community of business leaders is effectively divided. Some of them hate it, some of them love it, and essentially one need to very clearly look into what does it effectively mean. So what we try to understand then, how is in the business model, which is effectively how do firms make money, and on the basis of how do they integrate CSR thinking. So there has been some extensions, criticisms to the business model thinking, which led us to think, okay, not only looking at the stakeholder perspective, extending that further, not only looking at the value proposition, but really whose value is it that is being contributed by the firm. We looked at another dimension, who are the partners? Are these partners equally contributing to the generation of CSR outcomes, to value, social value generation, as we rephrased it at the later stage. So we looked at it very comprehensively and expanded the business model as suggested by a colleague in Germany, Bocken, who suggest, well, we can actually think around sustainable business models. In our case, what we have been doing when we went out, we implemented, so we are thinking around society, environment, and economy. Value propositions was such kind of the question how CSR thoughts are embodied in the orchestration and the build-up of the organization. So that's what we did. We added sustainability as a key concern in our research and in our interviews when we went out to key stakeholders. And there is a quite comprehensive literature on that, or emerging, some of which we have introduced ourselves at the bottom of the pyramid. There is suggestions by colleagues from LSE, for instance, Oxford, saying, well, sometimes, you know, this sustainability issues is a function of which markets you serve and so on. So just briefly to indicate what we have been doing operationally in terms of our methodology, and as I was indicating, I am specifically looking at the context of Indian firms. So we originally framed this whole empirical investigation against the background of literature that suggests some firms are emerging more and more quickly, more rapidly than others. So there is, for instance, the Boston Challenger ranking, and there are other kind of rankings out there which list every year newcomers to the international competition. And we looked at some of these firms, and amongst those which are sort of emerging on an international platform, as I was pointing out, in order to learn from compliance to particular standards and then to reintroduce that in the home domestic market. So we looked at some of these firms. We looked at also the books that I was mentioning earlier, a lot of case studies from Brazil by the authors here in the front and colleagues across US and UK. So we looked at what kind of firms are usually being talked about, and then we tried to find out what is it that such firms or even more nascent firms are doing, and in terms of their activities internationally and within the domestic market, and try to look at, you know, which kind of standards they are being adopting, implementing, and how they are going about in the operations. So we collected data in the Indian case. We had around 24 cases, meaning 24 firms which we actively engaged with. We did a number of interviews in a series of rounds. And what I would like to introduce, we did a couple of comprehensive theoretically inspired views. So basically this pattern matching, for instance, is a theoretical approach, how you match what you're looking for. So in the business model, right? So you match the dimensions which you're looking for in the business model to the narratives that are being given in the interviews. And by doing that, what you are able to do is effectively underpin the rationale that we are looking for. So I will only now, given that I think I should really speed up here to firm up at 10:30 was the designated end time, and we are at 10:29 here with Alfonso still waiting. So I will give only one example. I even will reveal the name. It's a firm in the garment and fashion industry, given that we are in Brazil and there is no Indian who would run after me. Madura, which is an Aditya Birla group. Aditya Birla is one of these family conglomerates based out of Mumbai. And they are, when you go into the business model dimension, I highlight here the most important ones. They are earlier a business-to-business company, but emerged very, very rapidly into business-to-consumer segments, and they own now their own retail outlets, and they have their own fashion, their own brands. Peter England would be one of those for people who buy suits, for instance, as one of the innovative labels that are out there. So already we would see in terms of the segments, that's quite in contrast to the assumptions, which the international business literature would give you. So they are not holding still at the core function, which they then try to exploit very well, but they are actually branching out and they are capturing essentially value across a whole set of activities. Key resources, just to highlight here one important dimension, for instance, with Peter England or with other brands, they introduced a number of very, very interesting products. They have a cotton-based product which feels as silk. They have and this product is innovative in the sense also because in the manufacturing process they have been able to reduce the water production by 80%. So they have been implementing some of the key constraints which you are faced with in the production process. Water consumption have been rapidly been able to downplay the needs for that. And also, interestingly enough, on the downstream, more close to the customers, they have been engaging in collaborations with Italian fashion designers. They are working quite directly with those, and so they have also their own design team, which sort of participates in the international activities. It's not something that is outsourced. Again, not outsourced as we would expect from the international business literature, but it is something which is really a key part of the key core competencies in this company. So let me come very quickly reading further on to the value proposition. Very important here is the fact that they are proposing, or the value is around an integrated value chain. So they are really ready-made garment production from production to retailing, and 80% is through their own channels. So again, very significantly integrated operations. And in terms of sustainability, that's the key thing that I was particularly keen on exploring. We were keen on, because as we can see here in our sub-project, Khalid was introducing that labor standard and environmental standard. So we were very keen to understand this particular dimension. So they are doing, in terms of sourcing, from compliant factories only, and they have very clear guidelines. They are having local and international standards which they are adhering to that, so this is all fact-checked. They have independent auditors, and there are loads of external visibility awards and certificates which they have received. For instance, Golden Peacocks Award, which is CSR award, and they have, although they don't have a CSR report as of yet, which is something which would indicate that they are already sort of very outward oriented and painting a golden picture here. They have at the time they didn't have a CSR report, but they have a lot of CSR upliftment and improvement activities. So I have a few more cases here which I don't want to go into, but I would like to highlight that now what I have been doing, again going back to some conceptual thinking, in how far does this now this social activity and what we call CSR sustainability activity, in how far does this now comply or fall in line with sort of philosophical aspects to sustainability. And what we have been doing here in our data analysis, we defined very clearly, and this is something that has been coming up in a publication by a colleague called Sethi, who talks about the value creation, or he talks about various stages of CSR, social responsibility, from an obligation, so something that you have to do in order to be compliant, right? This is the very minimal level of CSR activity, you could argue, to a social responsibility, which is no longer, if you think about the meaning of the word, is no longer reacting to some externally given requirements, but proactive, more in line with the expectation of your stakeholders, and proactively anticipating what the stakeholders could mean. So you are no longer limited to the law and the market forces, but you are actively looking into what are the social norms of this country, of your community within which you are engaging. And to social responsiveness, anticipating future harms. And we extended further, in one of our papers, we expanded further to a very, very proactive approach, which we'll call social value creation. So in how far does this firm not only do CSR 1.0 as it is in the literature, CSR 2.0, but above and beyond, and contribute basically intrinsically governed, in how far is this company intrinsically governed by good behavior, because that's the first thing that is supposed to do, it's the right thing to do, but then obviously it also delivers positive financial economic performance outcomes. So we were, just to highlight this, I was coding the data here, and going through these various dimensions, trying pattern match whether some of the responses and the evidence which we saw in the various empirical data sets which we tapped into, whether we find evidence to support CSR 1.0, 2.0, and further on social value creation. And Matura is just one example. I did this with a number of companies. I don't want to go further into those now, but you would see that what I have been doing, I've created an index according to CSR 1.0, 2.0. So we have in the first company a CSR of 2.5. Somebody at some stage will come up with a CSR 3.0. We have this notion of social value creation. So I would argue they are already there, almost there, in terms of the company embodying in the business model sustainability concerns. They are proactively governed by ethical norms and accountability, by transparency, fairness, reciprocity, and some of the other companies which we have seen here are doing fairly well as well. We have also some not so good examples here. But the key question that was triggering us initially, first of all, how are they operating and organizing the value chains, right? So Khalid was pointing that out. We looked at this from the perspective of the business model in this particular sub-project, and then indigenously try to establish in how far these firms do embody CSR thinking and work around that. And we do see, and this is again quite in contrast to the expectation, that some of the firms are effectively thriving and developing competitive advantage on the basis of sustainability being a key concern for the operations. In this case of Madura, one example that I was highlighting here is the water consumption. So there are external pressures, environmental pressures, which are particularly pertinent in the Indian market, right? This is to do with strong impacts of changes in the external climate, resource scarcity, particularly around inputs, water being one of those, and they embody that very constructively in their innovative processes, in the business model, and drive their agendas. So at this stage, I just provide a couple of outputs. Again, these would be found on the Rising Powers web page. Some of the work is already published, and we are continuing on this trajectory. Thank you.